So, with making believable characters, one of the first things you have to start with is the theme of the story. When you understand the theming of the story, you can have a better idea of what is or isn't a believable character. So, an adventure story is going to have very different characters from a horror story, which has different characters from a comedy story. When you understand the theme of the story that you want to go on, you have a better idea of what kind of characters you have. So, for example, you could definitely do some scary stuff in a horror story that may not necessarily fly in a comedy. That being said, you definitely can have characters that are in stories that don't necessarily match them thematically. However, when that's done, it's usually done with a reason. It should be done with your understanding. For example, with Jaskier in The Witcher show, who's again called Dandelion in the games and the books, but let's move past that. He's a very comedic character. He's played comedically, and he says comedic things, and he does comedic things. Quite honestly, it is quite a juxtaposition compared to a lot of the dark horror and dark fantasy of the Witcher series. That being said, it's done with a reason, and it can offer sobering insights at times. Because A, he's a comic relief, which can help be used to help relieve some of the tension of any given horror story, and it also offers sobering insights in times, such as I believe it was season 2, when it was revealed that he was actually smuggling elves and other people being discriminated against, attacked in these big pogroms, that he showed that the reason he cared about them is because he's an artist. Artists have to care about the vulnerable people around them because the vulnerable people are the artists themselves, and if someone doesn't speak up for the vulnerable people, they come for the artist in the end. Again, it's a very sobering insight of the character, and an interesting one. And it also makes sense why characters like Gantir Odim and even the Wild Hunt are so interested in him, because he offers insights into this world, and the way he shares his stories can make or break entire revolutions. And again, he's just a funny character. At least he starts as just the funny character of this dark fantasy. Now, if you do, let's say, a comedy, we'll say, for example, Cabin in the Woods. That's a horror comedy. You might have characters there that don't quite juxtapose, who seem like they might be an odd choice. You have a comedic scientist who does an awkward dance. That fits better in a comedy than it does in a horror. Again, you offer comic relief. You also offer insight into this, where these people are doing these horrible things, and these people are just living their lives, even after they do these horrible things. So it makes you think of your coworkers who might act in a similar way, who do the same dorky things or say the same dorky stuff. Like when he's talking with the Harbinger, and then the Harbinger is like, "Don't put me on speakerphone without telling me, man." And then the Harbinger goes into his dark spiel, which again fits thematically for horror. But then when you do the "Am I still on speakerphone?" then it makes things seem even more comedic. It offers a tension break, and again, it gives you insight into these characters. So, when if you're going to do a protagonist that is going to be using this kind of thing, then you're going to do then you should be careful with it, because if you understand your characters, you can understand what that is or isn't a good juxtaposition. Another way of focusing on making a character relatable, or at least believable, is their relationships to the protagonist. Ultimately, to make a believable character, you need to understand your protagonist and the character's relationships to the protagonist. The child is going to have a different relationship to their parent than to their teacher. Even an adult is going to have a different relationship with their parent than a child, or a teenager to a parent, or even any kind of variation you can think of there. Understand who your protagonist is, and from there you can craft the relationships to the characters around them. Crafting protagonists is going to be a completely different video, but here are a few basics that we can talk about. So the protagonist is the character who the story is about. In most stories, the protagonist is also the one telling the story. In some circumstances, usually anthologies, the narrator is completely separate from the protagonist. So if you're doing a story like this, then you have to consider your narrator as a separate character to the protagonist. Then you also have to consider, what's their relationship to the protagonist? Do they have a relationship to the protagonist, or are they just kind of someone who's talking about this? Again, the way I do my videos is for the most part. Aren't people like the Seven Cities journalist is separate from most of the characters that they're telling stories about. So because of that, they're a separate character, but they are a character in that world. So when I write those stories, I have to go into it with that consideration. There's always that infinitesimal but that near invisible line between the narrator and the protagonist. And there are times where when you're considering this, you have to make choices like that. Let's use an example outside of YouTube. Let's say those anthology shows like Tales from the Crypt Keeper or Elvira's show or even, I don't know, Mystery Science Theater 3000. The narrator is someone separate from it. There's someone who does a setup to the show. They might tell a joke or two. They might tell you what the story is about. Then they present the story, and when the story is done, or sometimes during the story, in case of Mystery Science Theater 3000, they actually talk about the story. They might tell a joke, they might offer comedic relief, and generally speaking, there's a bit of mystery to who they are. And again, that's if you're doing that style of thing. If your narrator is separate from your protagonist, you have to consider them as a separate character. But in most stories, your protagonist is the narrator, and in most stories, your protagonist is the hero. Again, that's not always the case, because ultimately your protagonist is just the one your story's about. Your story could be told from a monster's perspective. Your story could have a protagonist who's a serial killer. Your story could have death as the protagonist, for all I know. So just consider, if I'm going to be making a protagonist, this is just their perspective. They don't necessarily have to be a good guy. So when crafting the protagonist, you have to understand your character's age, gender, ethnicity, wealth, species, if applicable, and their role and place in society, what they want from the story, and what they are being opposed by. Relatively little details can make a big impact on the character's perspective. Someone who is working poor is likely a day or or two off work, or they're gonna see that a little differently from someone who can go on a 6 month hiatus from work and not even notice their money's being stolen. Looks knowingly at another creepypasta. Seriously, the guy I took a 6 month hiatus from work was being chased by an assassin. Had the assassin stealing $1,000 from his bank account every week, and he didn't even notice that was happening. Buddy, I get you were bored with your life, but maybe you should have just gone on a vacation. Seriously, seriously. Nonetheless, you have to consider these things because, like, these little details can make a big impact on their perspective, and again, can also make a big impact on how believable or unbelievable your character is. So, if your character is someone who is working in an office and is bored with life, and then they can take a 6 month hiatus, that's going to feel a lot less realistic than someone who is working poor and who is forced to take a week off to recover from an injury and is worried about paying the rent. And again, the gender differences is a fun one to think of. Someone who is masculine, feminine, or non binary, whether they're cis, transgender, or any sort of variation of that, they're going to have very different perspectives on things as simple as walking home alone at night, or even shopping for clothes, getting a haircut, choosing what food to eat, finding an animal to shop for, shopping for their friends, shopping for themselves. All those perspectives are going to be changed, sometimes immensely so, by just considering gender and whether they're trans or cis. So again, if you believe that it isn't important to have a character gender for the story, you're going to have to digest and think about the reason why it isn't important. Because again, you could legitimately tell a story like that. And again, there are things that are universal, but you do have to consider and really think about it. And so you're also going to have nationality and race will have an impact on the story and both the perspective of the character and how everyone around them sees them. Please note that nationality, race, and ethnicity are not necessarily interchangeable. People can have the same nationality and be a different race. People can have completely different nationalities have the same race. Then ethnicity, which is a blending of culture, nationality, race, can all have can have big impacts. Again, it comes down to perspective and location. Someone who's black in America is known to have a different perspective from someone who is black in France, or someone who is black in Nigeria, or someone who is black in Korea. or someone who is black in Australia or black in Brazil. All of those are going to have very different character perspectives and something you should consider if those are the kinds of stories you want to tell. And again, nationality is a fun one to think of because, again, depending on your audience and depending on the stories you tell, you may notice that a certain nationality comes up a lot. If you listen or read a lot of American stories, you're going to have a lot of protagonists that are American. If you read a lot of stories from Europe, you're going to have a lot of European protagonists. If you listen or read stories from Asia, you're going to have a lot of stories from there. Again, it's something you can consider. And again, knowing what your protagonist wants can drive the conflict, especially when there is a force, monster, or villain opposing their goals. Again, the conflict doesn't necessarily have to be something literal or even physical. Your story can be something as simple as getting up from the couch to get something from the fridge, and their conflict is their own laziness. Or it could be something as complex as they want to unite their family, and their conflict is the family is scattered across the world or time and space. Again, understanding what the opposing force is to what they want can make things interesting. Because again, let's use that family uniting example. Your family is lost at a park. You want everyone to come together. It's a relatively simple conflict. Now you add an opposing force. They're scattered in the same park, but they're scattered across time. Well, now you've just made the conflict a little more sci-fi or a little more horrific, depending on how you look at it. And again, you can do a lot of interesting things with it. So when you want to make something believable, you have to understand what kind of protagonist you want to create, and then you can see what you can do with that. Again, there's a whole video I can do on protagonists, and I've done an entire newsletter just on characters, so we're going to have to use this as a simple little jumping off point. Now, the opposing force to the protagonist is the antagonist. Antagonists are definitely interesting in horror settings because it goes from the simple man versus nature, or man versus self, or man versus other men, and starts becoming something you can really explore in a fictional or creative way. So now it's not just man versus nature, it'll be man versus a monster, or it might be man versus themselves as a clone. And again, you can have supernatural forces all over the place, and sometimes you can have a monster or conflict that's not necessarily something literal, but is something that can be metaphorical. So let's use a rather fun example. It's not technically a horror movie, but I like it because it's really allegorical. Pacific Rim. If you're familiar with Pacific Rim, you have these giant robots called Jaegers versus these giant kaiju called kaiju. And the kaiju, you realize later on in the movie, are a stand-in for hurricanes because they use a similar classification system based on water displacement and how toxic their blood is, similar to how we classify hurricanes by how much force is generated in them. So this gets interesting because you start to realize these kaiju are not just the monster, they're also a disaster that keeps getting worse, keeps getting worse, keeps getting worse. And humanity keeps trying to oppose it and keeps trying to build machines to fight it, or in some points tries to build a seawall to contain it. And as you probably noticed, is that doesn't quite work, and they have to go a very direct means of dealing with it. So again, sometimes when you're creating a monster, you have to think not just what the monster is, what does it represent? So let's use Jason from the Friday the 13th franchise. What does he represent? Is he a stranger danger? Is he a territorial force? Is he a supernatural threat? Is he a threat of bullying? Is he basically an anti-bullying or an anti-sex PSA on steroids? Again, these are things you want to think about when you're making your characters. Sometimes it can be as simple as the monster is a monster. It is a creature, and it acts that way. And again, that's a valid way of doing your story and writing it. So if you consider what your antagonist represents to the protagonist or why they're opposing him, you can make it feel realistic. So if you have your family trying to unite across time, well, what's the force opposing it? Is it time itself? If so, then you might make the conflict feel realistic. People wanting to connect with others, connecting with their loved ones, connecting with their family, only to be separated by time. You'll see things like that a lot, especially with family members who are passed away or family members who live far away, or even just people who change across time. We'll see you, Kingan. So you'll see things like that, and when you think about it, it can make a very unrealistic conflict feel very realistic. So with that in mind, because again, antagonists are a whole separate video, let's talk about the different kinds of relationships the protagonist can have with characters around them. So first, we're going to talk about the relationship of silent strangers. Your protagonists, whoever they are, have degrees of relationship with everyone around them. Imagine, if you will, a city with millions of people in it. As you travel through the city, you're not likely to think too much of the people around you. You might notice if they are in your way, you might notice if they do something incredibly unusual, but in situations with like a vast crowd of people, especially in situations like train stations, city streets, or factory floors, you need to establish what a sense of normality is and if a majority of people are behaving normally or not. So people in the train station are going to behave similar but differently than those on the street. People in a prison are going to behave differently from a factory. So establish what is expected in the setting full of strangers and whether or not the strangers are behaving normally. So let's use some examples. So if you're using a factory floor, a normal expectation is a lot of people are working. A lot of people are on the machines. It's probably a loud place. There might be some people scurrying around, but overall people are sitting and working. That's your normal expectation, and then you can establish that. But then you can also establish people behaving unusually. Wait, it's a factory floor, but it's silent. It's a factory floor, but no one's talking. It's a factory floor, but it's empty. If you establish what feels normal, then you can establish what feels abnormal to the situation. So once people get a sense of what is or isn't normal, then you can start to tease them or build their dread by showing them what's abnormal about the situation. And again, you can't go into this assuming that everyone in your audience knows what it's like to be in a city like yours, or knows what it's like to be in a factory, or knows what it is like to be in a prison. You have to establish that sense of normality and that sense of abnormality. Because again, not everyone's been in a prison. Not everyone's been in a city. Not everyone's even been in a factory. And again, you can't go into this assuming everyone knows what this is like. So again, let's talk about that a little more. So when you're the crowded auditorium is expected to stare at you when you're on stage. So also establish who your protagonist is in this setting. So let's use the example of the train station. If your protagonist is a passenger, there's an expectation of the way they act. Now, what if they're the janitor of the train station? The expectation of the way they act is going to be different. What if they are the conductor of the train station? Again, the way they act is expected to be different. What if they're a police officer on the train station? Their behavior is going to be different. What if they're the robber of the train station? Again, that's going to be very different. So again, you have to establish who your character is to this setting that they're in and who they are to the strangers around them. Because again, strangers are expected to act a certain way and can react very differently. Silent strangers are going to react differently to an armed gunman than they are an armed police officer, at least depending on situation and country. But my point still holds. Now, when you're describing a setting like that, you don't have to describe every single stranger. By describing the actions of one or two can establish an expectation. At the train station, talk about a tired parent wrangling their children, the musician in the corner trying to earn tips while performing, or the anxious teenager constantly checking their phone and the train's arrival. Those examples, along with the train station being crowded, can establish one vibe. Or you can mention the train station is empty, except for those examples. Well, now that makes the character and the setting have a very different vibe. Now suddenly you're in an empty train station except for the musician in the corner, except for the tired parent, and except for the anxious teenager. And also bear in mind, people are just strange. They'll be doing stuff like charging phones on their heads, pulling a fish out of their backpack, or holding babies up to paintings to look at them. These moments of individual strangeness allows your reader to glimpse the depths of humanity and how interesting people truly are. especially with settings where you're not going to get to know these characters very well. And those little bits of strangeness makes the character feel much more realistic, or at least believable. Because then it's oh yeah, I've seen people do weird stuff at the train station. Yeah, I've seen people do weird stuff at the factory floor. Hey, I've seen weird people in the city. And I don't know if you've known this, but there are people in cities. We will discuss setting later, but remember, your setting is a character. So anything that we talk about with characters can also be talked about with your setting. So after the silent strangers, we have familiar faces. Do you ever see people a lot, and even though you don't know their name, they're still a part of your day? Maybe a stranger who takes the same bus as you, who nods at you every time you see them, or a barista at a coffee shop who remembers your favorite order, but you only remember their name and face when looking at them. Or maybe a security guard who stands in front of City Hall, who always opens the door for you when they see you. Some people may still be strangers to you, but you still see them often enough to at least be familiar with them. When describing them, the protagonist should have a degree of familiarity with them. Describe the outfit the docent wears at the door. Docents are doorkeepers or ticket takers. Their smile, their voice, or the action they take when opening the door. Do they smile at the protagonist? Does it feel automatic or genuine? Do they make eye contact, or do they look away from the protagonist? Do they talk to the protagonist directly, or do they talk to the ground? Do they stand up straight and take their job seriously, or do they slump and act bored? Better yet, do they do these things in unexpected combinations? Do they smile at you but look at the ground? Do they slump until they notice you and stand up straight? Is their smile automatic until you smile back? These little details make the familiar faces feel familiar to the audience as well. These characters, you are okay to mention who they are and what they mean to the protagonist, but the way they look and the way they act reveals who they are as people to the audience. To use an example from, we have a character who actually grabs a coffee pot, tries to cut line to get food in front of everyone else, but then when he grabs the coffee, he refills someone else's coffee cup first before he refills his. What does that tell you about the character? Someone who's willing to cut in front of a bunch of strangers, but when he's talking to someone, he's willing to fill their coffee first before his own. That tells you more about his character and what kind of person you can expect from him than just directly stating it. And again, at this point, the only thing you know about him is his name and face. So again, familiar faces. These faces have to feel familiar to your protagonist, and then they can feel familiar to the audience. And again, it's a lot easier to show than tell. Sometimes there are things you have to tell, but it helps to show things, for example. It allows you to hint at depths without requiring the audience to know their entire backstory. You mentioned the bus driver has a picture of their family and a Pokemon keychain. That adds depth to them and allows you to recognize them as people. Plus, familiarity can also allow you to show contrast as well. If your barista has never smiled at you their entire life and has always served you the best coffee you've ever tasted, and one day they're beaming at you and they burn the coffee, then you know something is different about them, if they're even the same person. While your protagonist doesn't have to be friends with the familiar faces, they should at least be aware of who they are and have a passing familiarity, and they should be able to convey that to the audience. Little details and emotions can show that familiarity. But again, I'll leave it to you as the writers to figure out what is the best way to convey familiarity in your own story. So now we have professional pals, people you know professionally, not necessarily personally. From celebrities to coworkers, politicians to public servants, your protagonist will understand their role to them and their role to the professional. So, for example, if you're going to see a police officer, your protagonist is going to have some sort of relationship with at least the idea of a police officer, if not necessarily that police officer themselves. Do they have a do they like the police? Do they hate the police? Do they consider the police a nuisance or a threat? Do they consider the police a helper or do they consider them even friends? Again, their relationships to these professionals around them, whether it's a coworker or just a role that they're familiar with, will tell you a lot about them and the way your protagonists deal with them. The protagonist will understand your role to them and to their professional. However, it also nearly guarantees you won't know who they are fundamentally. If your protagonist has had a coworker for 10 years, they will probably know their coworker's name and birthday, maybe a few details about their life, but they won't know them on a personal or friendly level unless they actually are friends or if they actually know them close. So unless you are friends with your coworker or local public servant, then overall these are going to be just the, professional pals. For characters of this role, you can describe them physically, but the best way to show them as someone believable is to describe your feeling the protagonist has towards the professional or what they represent. They don't have to be the same thing. You can like the county clerk you've had to get permits from for years and still hate having to go get the permits. Do they hate their coworkers but are forced to act professional for their own job? Or maybe a celebrity is speaking on TV and your protagonist is enraptured by what they have to say because they are a fan. Or maybe they trust the person speaking on TV. Or do they see the person speaking on TV and they scoff before turning away because they think everything they say on TV is fake? While this can overlap with other character types to make these characters believable, you should focus on how they make the protagonist feel. And if you want to you can show juxtaposition by having another opinion compared to the protagonist. Are they creeped out by the clown that works at the nearby car dealership, but their best friend finds them hilarious? Do they find a singer attractive while their sibling only says how gross they are? Sometimes these characters represent institutions or concepts, and in cases like that, focus on the character's feelings towards the institutions. Does your protagonist see the police and think they represent safety from a threat? Or do they see the police as a threat to their goals? Or do they look at the police or in scoff? Any of these reactions can add depth to your protagonist or characters close to the protagonist. Do they look at soldiers and see them as just someone doing a job? Or do they look at soldiers and do they see heroes? Do they look at soldiers and do they have a panic attack? Again, these are all different ways of making your characters feel believable. Everyone has some different thought process about the professionals in their life or the professionals around them. And again, you can make characters feel believable in some way. If they hate the government, that's going to feel believable. They love the government. That's also going to feel believable. If there's some weird conspiracy theorist that believes the government's right about everything, that's also going to be a character. People are going to find it weird as heck, but at least it's going to feel like a believable character because it's something that they can engage with. And if you want another example, do they see priests as someone who helps or someone who are dishonest? These types of characters focus on how they make the character feel more than how they look to make them feel believable. But you don't have to ignore how they look either. Getting a basic idea of how they look can certainly help. Does the police officer look disheveled or do they look professional? Are they wearing body armor at all times or are they just wearing civilian clothes? Do they walk a certain way? Do they pose a certain way? For someone who's been in the United States, you probably get a pretty good vibe of how police look and walk, even when they're not in uniform. Again, things like this can make a character feel more believable. Because again, it's not just how they look, it's how do they make the protagonist feel, and what do these people represent to the protagonist. And again, these are not necessarily friends, although they can be. And again, that leads us to our next bullet point. Then we have the close companion. These are your best friends, your friend group, the people you know well or think you know well at least. These characters aren't those you describe how they make you feel. You are going to describe little details, their feelings, their goals, and how they are acting in the scene. They aren't just acting normal or strange. They aren't just making you feel good or sad. These are the people you have stories with, details that mean a lot. You cannot just say what the detail is, you need to describe why it is. Where you mentioned the bus driver has a Pokemon on the keychain, or a family in the photo for a close companion, you will know who in the picture is still alive, what relationship they have with the companion. You will say what Pokemon it is and what the story behind it if you know it. Is the Pokemon their favorite? Maybe it was a gift from you or someone else. Close companions are where you can allow your characters to grasp not just complexity, but also contradictions that reveal a lot about them. They may be someone who loves diner food but who also only shops organic for their own groceries. They might be someone who donates to church every Sunday and every Monday they rob banks. They may be someone who loves puzzles and is absolutely terrible at them. Fun fact, I'm describing someone I know in all of those situations, so good luck figuring out who is who, because I don't know. Your close companions will have stories with your protagonist. You aren't going to just say a single line or two to imply closeness. You have to show it. Depending on your story, if it's an entire series of novellas, then you can get the closeness gradually unravel. If you're doing a short story, you should spend at least a paragraph or two. And if you want your audience to care for a character, protagonists should care for them and have depth to their care. And again, this can really represent a lot of things. There's a difference between Antony from Ant-Man and Daisy, John Wick's dog, from the John Wick series. Because again, it's not just what they are or what they represent, it's what do they mean to the characters, how does that make them feel? Because again, you're with a close companion, you're going to get a good sense of like, oh, I see my friend. I can see they're upset. I think they're upset because of this reason. Or even just like oh, their lips just quivered in this moment. So this means this emotion, or this means they're thinking this thought. Again, when you get to close companions, that's where you start to know and understand what they're feeling, possibly what they're thinking. And again, you have to show these stories and depth with them. You can't just do oh, we used to shoot turkeys together at the farm. Oh, this is just like that time we stood up to the bullies up in the alley. Remember that? Or things like that. Again, you can do little jokes like that to add to it, but you can't have that be your entire thing. To use an example from the MCU, when both Hawkeye and Black Widow mention Budapest together, it's like, oh, it's just like Budapest. You and I remember Budapest very differently. They don't reveal until much later what exactly happened in Budapest, and it just raises more questions than answers. And that is basically the entire backstory we get between them. Which is, again, a little weird, but whatever. And again, you can use these little jokes and things to imply closeness, but again, you have to show these things in a way that matters. And again, there are a lot more than one ways to do it, so I'll leave it to you to decide which is best. But consider, if you want your characters to care about a close companion, you can't just kill them off. You can't just be like, oh, whatever, this happened and now it's over. You need to have them have an actual sense of closeness in some kind of relationship to each other. Again, if you're going to kill someone off as like your verified victim, or if you need to, or you need your doomed companion, then you need to show why they're important or why they care. If you're doing Coraline, you'd show an entire relationship from strangers to friends between YB and Coraline. And then you also see that closeness with YB's clone, and you understand why, by showing YB's body, is so upsetting for Coraline. So again, you get a chance to actually let that breathe and let that unravel and get a chance to show it. And again, things like that really matter. So know your format of the story and you can do it pretty well. And again, maybe your protagonist doesn't have any close companions to them. And that's okay too. But just be aware here that's a good way of showing a believable type of close companionship with them. But when we get past close companion, we get to something a little more extreme. So with blood brothers, not literal blood brothers, but this is the depth of the character, the protagonist isn't just thinking about what they are feeling. They will see things and it will remind them of their blood brother. They may be shopping and see a Jeff the Shark comic and immediately think about how their friend has been looking for it. The protagonist isn't just knowing what they are feeling, they are feeling it with their blood brother. The betrayal of a companion hurts. The betrayal of a blood brother will feel like you're dying. And again, this can be romantic, this can be platonic, this can be somewhere between platonic and romantic. It can be whatever Sam and Frodo had, it can be whatever Magneto and not Magneto had. It could be whatever you had between Odysseus and Penelope. Your blood brother characters may not even like your protagonist. Magneto and Professor X come to mind. Even as enemies, the level of respect and understanding between them is profound. They have a long history and a lot of care between them. And again, you see people try this a lot. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. Sometimes you get things like Megatron and Optimus Prime. Sometimes you're going to get stuff like Magneto and the X-Men. Sometimes you're going to get all kinds of things. So again, when you get to this, you're not just thinking, what are they feeling? You are feeling what they are feeling. You know what they are thinking, at least in some way. Some can even interpret a blood brother bond as romantic, or even with a platonic interpretation. It is still a very deep level of understanding. Some characters will even be departed and still be blood brothers with each other. And if you want characters like that who have a deep, enduring impact on the protagonist, you will need a character that reminds your protagonist of them, even with unrelated sights or thoughts. You may hear a song that reminds you of your nemesis. You may see someone order extra ranch at a restaurant and be reminded of your abuser. Because again, these blood brother level bonds aren't always positive. These are just these levels of relationship where like these little things will remind you of this person. It's not just a casual, oh, this person is kind of interesting, or hey, maybe my best friend will like this. This is you look outside, you see the sunlight, and you're reminded of their smile. You hear a noise in the walls, and you're reminded of the way they talk to you. Again, positive or negative. You may see a recommended video on YouTube and immediately have your shoulders slump because it was introduced to you by an ex once upon a time. But the contrast is also true. You may see a painting in an exhibit and think of someone you love, whether they are still around you or not. You may see a toy in a toy store and remember getting it for your child. You may see an artist painting and the color of yellow reminds you of your best friend. By focusing on how little things leads to big emotions, it can add believability to these kinds of characters. It can be done simply or complexly. In a fun example I'm going to try to link to later, in Monstrously Cute, there is a vampire named Carlotta who hears a banshee death metal band, and she is holding her hands close to her heart because it reminds her of a lullaby sung to her by her mother. Vampires and banshees are not realistic characters. However, someone hearing a song that reminds them of someone they love is either familiar to the audience on a personal level, or at least something understandable enough to make a very inhuman character suddenly very human, to make a very unbelievable character very believable. If you want a non-horror example of this, let's look at the Avengers during the Avengers movie 2 with the Age of Ultron, when everyone comes around and they actually start trying to lift Thor's hammer. So everyone has different approaches to trying to lift Thor's hammer, but everyone's joking, everyone's talking about it, everyone's having a fun time. And again, the way they're interacting with the hammer and the way they're interacting with each other reveals a lot about their characters. Tony Stark makes a joke about it before he tries to lift it. When he suddenly realizes he can't lift it, he immediately gets a tool to help him. When the tool fails, he immediately calls his friend and then gives his friend a tool, and then both of them try to lift it together. That reveals a lot about his character and who he's closest with, which is in this case Ace, Ace War Machine. And then again, you're going to see people like Clint, who again makes a joke, tries to lift it, and again, people who don't quite get it. And then there's Natasha, who doesn't actually participate because again, she doesn't actually feel that she needs to prove herself to anyone, and she doesn't need to prove or even think about this. She already knows the answer in her mind. One way or another, she either knows she can't lift it, or she knows she can lift it. And whatever the answer is, she's correct. And then you have Bruce Banner, who again tries to do the nerdy thing and tries to lift it, and then when that fails, he makes a joke about the big monster, only to realize that everyone around him is actually terrified of the Hulk. So again, his personal experiences with it, where he's trying to cope with humor, is something that everyone around him is not at the same level of coping he is at. Again, those little details led to big conclusions. And you, as the writer, will know your characters. And when you know your characters, those little things make a big difference. So, to point out what Mackenzie, one of the people who joined the chat here and asked a question, how do you avoid art? How do you follow archetypes without following cliches or stereotypes? Those little details make a big impact. So you have a jock who is a big fan of football and does it a lot. Well, why are they a big fan? Well, it's what they used to do with their parents before their parents died, and they still want to do it. Or it's the thing they need to do so that way they can get out of their town because it's the only way they can afford to pay for college. Or you have a nerdy character. You have a quiet, withdrawn character. Well, why are they quiet and withdrawn? Well, they've lost everyone in their lives, and the books are the only way to stay close. Or maybe because they had a love for writing and reading, and this is the way they cope with things. Or maybe because they've had bad experiences in the past, and when they try to go out there, and this is their way of feeling safe. And again, when you break down a lot of the 80s stereotypes, you may notice a lot of neurodivergence, and you may notice a lot of unresolved trauma. And by unresolved trauma, I mean people resolving their trauma with horror movies, which you may have noticed has actually turned out quite well for a lot of horror writers. And I recommend you do that too, Mackenzie, or anyone else listening. Hope you don't mind calling you Mackenzie. If you want me to change that, let me know. So once we've now talked about different types of relationships, let's talk about the fun little details of the characters. So once we have established our character relationships with each other, let's establish character flaws. Flaws make people perfect. Weaknesses into strengths, strengths into weaknesses. Mistakes, imperfections, some obvious, some less so. Contradictions can show character flaws very well. A professional who aspires to greater roles but also feels responsible for their work. A serial killer with their own code of conduct. Or a doctor who has developed apathy towards their patients. A god who cares too little, or a devil who cares too much, can represent character flaws and make a character more interesting. It's how you get characters like Michael in The Good Place or Victor in From. While Michael is essentially a demon, he loves and is fascinated with being human and helps trigger his journey and growth into a better person. And Victor in From cares about people, but he has also been hurt so often that he distances himself from people even when he cares about them. The best part of character flaws is they reveal a lot, and to an observant audience, it can make or break a character of their arc. So, to use an example, let's think about a character who wants to respect everyone's culture around them, even if they're not hers. And she also has a fundamental belief that women are equal to men. Now, if she's in a situation where she's in a country where where the common belief is that women are inferior to men, now we have an immediate conflict where she wants to respect the culture, while the culture itself also conflicts with her own personal beliefs. Or you can compare this with a conspiracy theorist with a radio station who believes in aliens and that aliens are the cause of every possible evil, but who disbelieves in giant spiders, reveals a lot in what he believes is or isn't possible or what is or isn't believable. And again, it's an interesting character flaw, whereas you can believe in so many unbelievable things, but not this one thing. Or you can have a mother who is said to be loving to her children, who shakes her head when telling her children how proud she is of them, reveals that she has thoughts she isn't sharing with her children. Sometimes flaws work organically into a story, and sometimes you have to make them. The best way to work a flaw in is by showing a place where a character's ideals, traits, or desires conflict. Consider this a writing exercise. Create a character with two or more admirable traits and then create a situation where those traits are in conflict. My example that I came up with earlier, someone who believes that cultures should be respected even if they're not hers, and who also believes that women are equal to men in a culture where that belief is not shared, is itself a conflict. And again, the resolution of that conflict could be interesting. Because whether she conforms to the cultural beliefs or she conflicts with it, either way, it creates an immediate conflict and it allows you to start building a story from there. So, with yourself, you can put down in the description or comment section down below. You create these two characters with you create a character with two admirable traits and make those admirable traits conflict. And the contrast to character weaknesses is character strengths. A character cannot just be weak in every situation. A character cannot simply be a null normal in all situations. But even if a character is so profoundly normal that it is disturbing, then by all means do that. Idiocracy, Little Evil, and Tales from the Gas Station thrive because the character is so profoundly average in unusual situations. But even then, there has to be strengths of some kind. In Little Evil, the stepfather is someone who genuinely wants to make a connection, and he has the emotional intelligence that makes him able to examine situations that others cannot. Jack from the gas station is able to notice inconsistencies and put clues together to at least logically process what is happening around him. Imagine being able to spot the difference between an illusion, hallucination, and the supernatural because of his own condition and his past. The main character from Idiocracy is able to recognize where he is at, eventually, and manipulate people around him to give him a chance, but he also acknowledges that he is where he is in life because that's where he let people put him. Sometimes a character's strength is less who the character is and what they represent, either to the story or to the theme of the story. So, for example, in Dawn of the Dead, we have a nurse character. She is helpful, she's a healer, and she knows a lot of useful things because she is a nurse. In a mystery, the detective may be the protagonist, but the detective can also represent enlightenment, and that may be their strength. But just like how weaknesses can be strengths, so too can strengths be weaknesses. Someone who pays attention to little details to unravel big mysteries may miss something obvious. Someone high energy may be a strength until they are in a situation where they need to be quiet and patient. And where the strengths are made into weaknesses and weaknesses are made into strengths, adds depth to your story and will engage your audience, and again can reveal a weakness. Because again, a weakness is only a weakness until it's a strength. And again, depending on the kind of story you're telling, these can be completely switchable. Prince, who is so giving that he just gives out money for free, he seems kind until he's in a situation where giving the money out causes him to be robbed. Or a prince who is so stingy that he never gives any coins out, so that attracts the ire of the Fae. And again, these kinds of strengths and weaknesses depend on the story and what kind of themes and what kind of story you want to tell. So again, let your situation, let your protagonist, and let you as a writer decide what is a strength and what is a weakness. And just know that strengths and weaknesses are completely dependent on context, and that can show a lot for both your characters and for you. Now that you understand your character's flaws and strengths, now let's understand their motivation. Why does your character want what they want? The closer to the protagonist, the more details will be revealed. A stranger motivated by money is enough to accept it as is. Someone more familiar may want more, such as Harley Quinn's landlord in the Birds of Prey movie. He betrayed her for money because he wanted to get out of Gotham, which, if you know anything about Gotham, makes sense. But if there is a professional pal motivated by money, you may find out they've been consistently struggling with money and that they need stability. They may have been trying plan after plan, and this is the first one that worked. If they are a close companion, they may have a sick relative, they may be sick themselves, or maybe a project that requires a lot of money to go through. And now they have it. It may be a struggle to betray you, but it was something they wanted for a long time, and it may be something the protagonist always wanted. When a blood brother is motivated by money, this will be something the protagonist was aware of, but they may have thought they were special or protected from it. The betrayal won't just be a reveal of true character, but force the protagonist to re-examine their relationship and their memories with their blood brother. And again, understanding character motivations goes a long way. There's an antagonist motivated by money. It feels simplistic, unless there's some kind of reason behind needing money. Again, there's exceptions to this. In Grounded, we have Director Schmechter. Yes, that is the actual name, Director Schmechter. And he is motivated by money. That's his main motivation. That is the reason he basically violates the laws of humanity and the laws of physics. He's motivated by money and he'll get what he wants because of it. So with that in mind, it's a relatively simple form of motivation, but an effective one. And again, you can deepen or you can simplify motivations. Because again, the better you understand the character, the better you understand the motivation. And again, this should be true of your protagonist as well. They understand their antagonist, they're going to understand their motivations better than if they're a complete stranger. And if they're a complete stranger, the motivation may seem simple or obvious. And again, it may not necessarily be accurate, but it's at least something that's understood. If you're being chased by a monster, a stranger looks at you and runs into their house, your initial thought might be like, oh, they're scared. And then they may come out with a gun and then they fire it at the monster. And then your thought process is like, oh, they were trying to help. Or maybe they ran into their house to protect their family. Or maybe they ran into their house to call the police. Maybe they ran into their house to grab something to start chasing you too. You don't know because it's a stranger. But again, understanding the motivation, at least in a simplistic way, allows you to make the characters feel more believable. Because everyone on this earth wants something for some reason. Even if the only thing they want is a quiet day inside, there's a reason they want it. Again, simple motivations can allow for compelling characters, or complex motivations can also make very simplistic characters. It comes down to how you use it and the way and why you use it. Because again, it might be funny to be like, oh, here's a granny in the Twisted Metal tournament. Her motivation is she wants to protect her dog and have a quiet day inside. That's why she's running, because if she wins, she'll get her quiet day inside. Or maybe you have a complex motivation like Sweet Tooth, who wants to actually chase down his last daughter because he wants to kill her, because he's a serial killer who's killed the rest of his family, and now he wants to kill the last one that he cannot find. Spoiler alert for that video game. When he did find his daughter, when he used his last wish to find her, he woke up inside her coffin underground because she was already dead. And again, he was motivated by finding her, trying to kill her. Again, an interesting motivation, and when you gave the character exactly what they want, it immediately backfired on them. Fun little twist, a fun little bit of horror. So consider the motivation and understand that sometimes what the character wants may actually work against them. So again, think about these things and allow yourself to explore it. If you want a simple motivation because you want to focus your story to be somewhere else, by all means do that. If you want a complex or complicated motivation because where you want it to end is going to be affected by that motivation, explore that too. Just ask yourself, what does your motivation mean to the character? What does it mean to you as the author? And what does it mean to the audience? You'll explore it and you'll find a lot of fun ways of doing it. Now you have the conflict, the fun part of the story. I say fun. There's a lot of different fun parts of the story, but the conflict is generally the stuff people are most motivated by. Your character wants something. What is keeping them from getting it? Whether it is something as common as money or something as profound as love, what is keeping them from their goal? Some people work their entire lives not ever reaching their goals. Others reach their life goal only to have the rest of their life still ahead of them. Some people seek new goals every time, always seeking something new and seeking a new conflict. Whatever your character wants, something has to keep them from it. Let's use a fun example I really, really love on a personal level. Anyone here heard of Frostpunk? Really long story short, it's a game where you manage a city in a post-apocalyptic frozen wasteland. So a big part of the character's motivation is the city must survive. That's their motivation. The city must survive. What that entails, however, is something can lead to a lot of different endings and a lot of different types of cities. Because again, the environment is frozen and it's getting colder nearly every day until it reaches the point where it is so cold that the nitrogen in the air can freeze to death, can freeze solid if you don't treat it with steam first. That is how cold it gets. And again, your choices affect the game, and again, your motivation is you must survive. The city must survive. And again, that can look a lot of different ways. Does it mean you enslave the entire city just to keep it burning? Do you use machines to keep it running? Do you try to find a balance between a comfortable life and also a life where people don't die? Or do you just decide that it's best to exile yourself so someone else will lead? Or maybe you decide that you need to amputate half your population just to keep them fed. Again, all those things can lead to a lot of different things because the motivation is the city must survive, is one of the catchphrases of the game. Your conflict is the storm outside. And then there's complications like some of your food freezes, or a coal mine collapses, or people try to leave the city for another city. Those, which are complications, adds to the conflict. And the main difference between the conflict and the complication is the conflict is the main part. It's the ongoing conflict. It's the ongoing opposing force. A complication is a relatively speaking little detail or little person that makes things more difficult. If you're in a situation where you're stuck inside because there's a blizzard outside and then there's a monster, the monster might be a complication. Or the monster might be the main conflict and then the blizzard's the complication. You don't know. It kind of depends on the way you write your story. Again, complications should add to your conflict in some way. They shouldn't distract or take away from your conflict. So let's use an example. If you have like an ongoing zombie survival show and you have a constant conflict of the undead, and then you spend nearly an entire season just dealing with one human antagonist. Well, you've just turned a complication into its own conflict, and then that conflict distracts from the primary conflict of the living dead. And again, this can make the show feel a little shallow, or can even make it feel just a little disingenuous, because then people invest their time into one thing and then they're getting something else. Not saying you can't have post-apocalyptic or even zombie shows and not have a human conflict. By all means, do that, but just also understand what your primary conflict is before you start adding your complications to it. And again, your conflict could be something as simple as your character wants to go home, and then their complications could be they get kidnapped by aliens, they get kidnapped by a cult, they got kidnapped by zombies, they got kidnapped by mermaids, and they got kidnapped by fae, all just on their way home, and they had to escape one each time. That's fine. That's a completely valid way of telling a story. But again, the primary conflict is in trying to go home. And because of that, that is what is driving me here. I'm trying to go home. There is something keeping me from going home. And again, motivation can be something as simple as wanting a drink from the fridge, and the conflict can be their own laziness keeping them in the chair. A simple conflict, but one that can be believable or at least understandable at least. And when you have a character with understandable motivations and an understandable conflict, then it makes the characters feel a lot more believable. Because everyone's just generally had those kinds of days. Where it's just like, well, of course that happened. Might as well happen. Where it's just like, of course I got kidnapped by aliens. It's a Thursday. Something's always happening on Thursdays. So again, you can add something to this depth. You can make even the most ridiculous conflict feel believable just by having a character with a motivation you can understand. If you try having characters without motivation, it can generally make things a lot harder. Actors talk a lot about their motivation, which makes sense. It helps drive the story forward. And you, as the writer, depending on the type of writing, you either have to think a lot about motivation or a little bit. But generally speaking, you should at least understand it and understand the conflict before you're writing it. Because if you don't understand it, it can make the story a lot harder to understand. And it can make it easier for a story to meander and become something else from what you were intending. Again, sometimes that's the price of the beast. You started writing one thing and you wrote something else. But at the same time, you kind of need to stick to something at least a little bit. That being said, we're going to go from talking about motivation and conflict to talking about something everyone absolutely loves. We're going to be talking about biases. Now, when you're describing a character using a trait or detail to hint at who they are, be aware of your own biases and ask yourself, why are you using those traits? Does your nerdy character have an anime character on their backpack and big glasses on their face? Why do you need to have an anime character and big glasses to show that they are nerdy? Is your greedy character overweight with bad hygiene? Why do they need to be overweight with bad hygiene to show you're greedy? If you want to show a compassionate person, do they dress professionally at all times with a smile plastered on their face? Or do they look like something else entirely? Racial, gender, disability, bias are all topics that can be examined and should be examined when making your characters. Consider if you are making a stereotypical jock, nerd, or cheerleader. What race do they all have? What gender do they all have? Are they disabled or non-disabled? Consider if you change it, does it make you uncomfortable? And if so, sit with yourself and examine why it doesn't make you uncomfortable. If you truly examine your own biases and biases of society at large while you explore your characters, you can truly make characters that are both believable and unique. Because again, these biases may not even be intentional, they still occur a lot. Let's refer to a recent horror whatever film that has Nicolas Cage in it, known as The Parents. There is an event occurring. No one's quite sure what the source is. Might be radio, might be chemical, might be germ, might be psychological. It's not real explored. But the event causes parents to want to kill their own biological children. And again, other than that, their mentality is not really shifted. They don't attack anyone's children that are near them. They don't assist others in killing them. They're not necessarily stopping them, but they're not assisting in it either. And then you also have people who still have their relationships with the other adults and other children around them. So again, pretty straightforward. They want to kill their children, but other than that, their psychology is pretty much unaffected. So with that in mind, there is a black character in the film who gets attacked by his dad, and his first thought is that his dad was being abusive again. Okay, you're establishing a character has an abusive background, makes sense. He winds up in self-defense killing his dad. He heads to his white friends and then explains the situation. And then when his friends start getting attacked by their parents, the parents keep accidentally attacking the black friend and then keep letting the friend get injured, keep knocking him over stairs, keep knocking him from the second floor, keep him down on the floor, or let him bleed out without calling for help or without even acknowledging the fact that he's there, or even in just, directly attacking or wanting to kill him for getting in their way. So again, this raises a lot of questions of bias of both the writers and the characters themselves. Okay, so your psychology has been unaffected for anyone unrelated to anyone who is not your own biological children. So why did you attack this kid that wasn't yours? Why did you knock him down from the second story film? Why did you stab him through the face? Why did you leave him to bleed on the floor and then neither call for help nor kill him? Again, when you actually examine that, it starts to become an uncomfortable sense of bias, and quite frankly, it does feel like it is racism of either the character's parts or on the own writer's parts. And again, I'm not sure what the writer's intent was, I'm not looking into it, but again, death of the author there. But when we start examining it that way, that bias becomes quite apparent. Again, it was one of the first things I noticed the first time I watched the movie, which is like, wow, they're treating this black character really harshly. And then towards the end, it's like, no, they're not just treating him harshly, they're basically treating him like a punching bag. You see that a lot in horror films, and it's been described and talked a lot by people both smarter than me and people dumber than me. I'll let you to decide who is who. And where people are like, well, clearly the black character keeps getting attacked first. Clearly the black character dies for shock value. Clearly the black character's role is to be the doomed companion. And when you sit and examine it, you see that it occurs a lot. It starts to become uncomfortable. And then you start examining your biases and your own societal biases or the biases of the writer, which is, why does this black character need to die first? Sometimes people do it for comedic effect or just to point out the trope itself. Then it's a question of, is this drawing attention to the trope for criticism, or is this just adding to the racism that itself is trying to criticize? Again, that can be done on a case-by-case basis, but there's a lot better people and smarter people at describing those from me. Even with Final Girls, which is, again, comedic satire horror, has a black character whose entire role is to be a hiker, try to sleep with one of the camp counselors, and then get killed. I don't even think he has a name. And again, it's interesting that he's the first victim and that he's also the black character. So, what does that tell you? And again, you see this a lot with all kinds of interesting biases. You'll see characters who are LGBT, gay, or queer in some way who get targeted either by the killer or get targeted by society at large or something meant to represent a killer or society at large. Again, sometimes it's done for comedic effect, like in Freaky, basically a Freaky Friday or a comedy where the serial killer switches places with the final girl. Again, interesting film, really should be examined. But one of the things the two best friends yelled while they were running is the gay character is like, I'm gay, you're black, he's a serial killer, we're not going to make it. Again, it's done for comedic effect, especially since, spoiler alert, they do live, surprisingly untouched. But again, examining these biases and examining why is this such a common thing, you can either invert it or add details that can change it. Again, not saying that you can't have characters die, not saying you can't get characters that get hurt, because again, it's horror that tends to happen. But when you start focusing a lot on one character specifically getting singled out, it starts to ask questions of your own biases or the biases of the characters around you. And again, that's just racial and queer. And again, there are lots of different ways that it gets examined. You will find that certain races get more sexualized than others. Again, occurs a lot, especially if you have a Latin character. Generally, they get sexualized quite a bit. You may have characters from East Asia get sexualized a lot. You have characters who are from the Middle East or North Africa being considered raised in broken or refugee families, and then you have black characters who again tend to get brutalized a lot, either institutionally or also by their own families or support systems. Again, there may be legitimate criticisms or things they are trying to say, but you also have to actually explore it and think about it rather than falling into stereotypes and cliches. And again, actually thinking about it and examining it, you can think about why something is a cliche or why this is a stereotype, and then you can either try to avoid it or you can actually try to expose why is this a thing? Because again, why are these your biases? Why are these your thoughts? Why is this the societal biases that got reflected down to you? You think about it, you sit with it, you examine it, you can do a lot with it. Now again, those are racial queer, but there's also one we didn't get a chance to talk about too much just yet, disability or physical ability, whatever you want to call it. But disability shows itself in a lot of different ways, and it is no surprise to anyone that disability has often been used as a quick sign of showing a character as either being a threat, a character being scary, or even just a character being evil. You have Jason Voorhees with his deformed face and apparent mental handicaps. You have frickin' Michael Myers, not the comedian, the actual slasher, who who was as physically disabled under his mask, or monstrous, depending on which canon or story you're in. And then you have him with apparent mental disability as well. I say apparent because it's not real clear what's going on there, but it's clear they're trying to make fun of sociopathy or psychopathy there. Or you'll have characters with the visual shorthands that they are mentally ill or they're a threat in some way. You have Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He is physically has scars, has a skin condition, and is also has mental disabilities. And again, this all affects the character. And weird, interesting thing about the Chainsaw Massacre, it's one of the few things I know about the author and actor's intent that I think adds to it, is the point of it there is that he was just as scared he was scared of his victims, and the whole reason he's attacking is he's more scared of his family. But that's why Leatherface is nearly constantly screaming, either when people are screaming or even when he's chasing them. He's not screaming because he's trying to scare them. He's screaming because he himself is also scared. So again, there's something interesting you can explore there. And also just the fact that it's like, well, this character is disabled. So clearly they're a threat in some way, right? And again, if you examine this, you even see this a lot with the Harbinger trait, which I love the Harbinger. Absolutely love them. Love them, love them, love them, love them, love them. A lot of them tend to be older people, generally isolated hermits. And you get the sense of like, oh, there is something wrong with you mentally, right? And that's generally the sense that you get, where it's like, oh, this person's a threat because there is something mentally wrong with them. But when you sit and examine these biases, you start to realize there is something truly wrong with this. Because again, I don't need to pull up the statistics. A lot of people have already discussed it. But essentially, if you are schizophrenic or you do suffer from psychopathy, hallucinations, DID, or you hear voices or anything like that, you're more likely to be targeted for crime than be the one who is perpetuating a crime. Again, there's exceptions, there's differences, but again, when you start seeing all these different signs of like, well, this person's a psychopath in this movie and they're a threat. This person's a psychopath and they're a threat. This person's a psychopath and they're a threat. This person has a skin condition, they're a threat. This person has something wrong with their head and they're a threat. This person gets bullied a lot and they became a threat. And this person is a loner and they became a threat. You start to see why these biases can start to filter into the general audiences, and why people start to get scared of things when they logically either shouldn't be or there are greater threats. For example, there are quite shocking statistics where caretakers will frequently abuse the people are taking care of. And a lot of these statistics are quite horrifying. And you may have people who are taken care of finally try to defend themselves. Then it gets framed as they were a threat. Oh, they just randomly attacked someone because that person grabbed their wheelchair and tried to wheel them away, is an example that comes to mind. And again, that's a disability bias. Again, when you go outside horror, disability can kind of generally be seen as something else. Some fantasies will have disabled seer characters, they'll have blind characters who are wise, they'll have deaf characters who generally do things. So again, depending on your goals, you may want to like go for extremely positive representation in of minorities or people who are disabled or people who are queer. That's fine. By all means do that. Go for the positive message. Share your own story, especially if you are someone who is within those communities. I am someone who is disabled. I know a lot of people who are disabled. I know a lot of people who are deaf. I know a lot of people who are blind. So I write a lot of stories about people like that. And again, as you've clearly heard from this video, I have a lot of thoughts on things like that, even though I have, and I love horror. I know a lot of people who are queer. I myself am queer. I know a lot of people of color, and I myself am a person of color. I don't necessarily always pass as a person of color, and that's its own whole discussion about what is or isn't white passing, what is or isn't biracial, and how people treat that, and colorism and racism, but that's a whole other video. But the biases are something that you can notice around you and you can criticize it in your story and you can even poke fun at it. You can show what's going on. But again, these are the kinds of stories that you yourself as the writer should examine. So with that all in mind, let's think about some other things. So let's give you a writing exercise. So if you want to examine your own biases and biases of society at large while you explore your characters, you can truly make characters that are both believable and unique. If you want a writing exercise, consider superheroes. Create a team of superheroes, any superheroes you want. Then create a team of supervillains. Figure out what character archetypes and abilities you want to create for your teams. Now consider your initial thoughts on what they look like and try something different. It can be gender, it can be race, it can be scars, it can be a disability, physical or mental. It can even be their age. It can even be the country they're from, or it can be all of the above. Once your teams are created, now swap the appearance of your superheroes and your supervillains. Now, once their appearances are swapped, do they feel right? Why or why not? You have an expectation on what a hero looks like. You have an expectation on what a villain looks like. When you swap them even in your mind, what does it reveal about your own expectations or biases? Now let's talk about tips and tricks. These are little things that don't necessarily need an entire slide, but can generally be helpful little tips to help you get started. Again, some of these I've written down, some of these I will be thinking of while I'm talking about it with you, and some things we might just post in the comments. So if you feel you have any tips or tricks that might be handy, feel free to post in the comments below and we'll definitely go over them. But let's talk about some tips and tricks for some stuff I like and some stuff I don't like and some stuff I think may help your characters feel more believable. So when creating an expert character, they should not be reminded of something incredibly basic about their profession. For example, when you're in an active war scenario against an alien fungus, odds are it isn't going to take the military 3 years to find out the fungus is vulnerable to fire. Seriously, 3 years to find out it's vulnerable to fire. If it was something that occurred that night, then yeah, it might make sense. It might take them some time to figure it out. It's not going to take the military 3 years to find out that fungus is vulnerable to fire when a civilian decides to set fire to a fungus. That does not take 3 years. That does not take 3 years for an entire planet to figure that out. Now, you can't definitely, to the contrast of that, you definitely can have a character making a character who's more of a generalist is make a clever connection. And again, it's more fun to see characters be clever than it is to watch characters be stupid. Because again, if you have a character who's claiming to be a professional, we're going to expect professional level things. If you have a character who claims to not be a professional, but they come up with something clever, that feels like it's going to be a win. Again, a fun thing there. Now, another example of an expert doing something bad. If you have a character who is an expert xenobiologist, they should not try to touch an alien penis snake that is hissing at them. Again, your average kid knows not to touch something that's actively hissing at them. Hell, it is a fucking response for people. Like that thing hisses, you step back. It is an instinct we have programmed. There is no way that someone who is an expert on aliens and an expert biologist not make an incredibly basic connection that the average age 3-year-old can make. And again, it's okay for generalist characters to make connections the expert doesn't, especially outside their field of expertise. But the audience is going to have a strong expectation that an expert should not be told basic things that 95% of your audience is going to immediately realize about this profession. Again, if you have a soldier character, they should not be told what the hell basic training is. If you have a scientist character who's an expert on space, they should not be told what a meteorite is. And again, if you have characters who are generalists or people who are not experts, they may have surprising information that might be fun. A random teenager on the street might be like, that's a meteorite, not a meteor, because meteors burst in the atmosphere while meteorites don't. That's kind of cool. You wouldn't expect a teen to have that knowledge, but it makes sense that they might. Or you might have a survivalist in the middle of the woods looking at strange runes, and they're like, what's this? And then their friend is like, oh, these are Celtic runes. I recognize some of these. I can't read them, but I recognize them as Celtic. Weird to see them in the middle of Brazil, but that's what they are. Again, an unexpected bit of knowledge can come in handy, but someone who is an expert should really not be missing basic stuff. So please, if you have an expert that's going to miss something basic, at least have them miss something basic outside their field of expertise. A biologist might not know much about space. That's fine. Someone who's a soldier might not know a whole lot about making coffee. I'm making that as a joke, but I guess a better example is a soldier might not know a lot about tech support. And those are fine. You can have expert characters or people who know random things. And again, it's fine for people not to know something basic outside their own wheelhouse. But they should understand the basics of their own profession and their own things they're claiming to be an expert in. I might have had to deal with more than a few people claiming to be experts who weren't experts. Looks knowingly at a convention. For entities, monsters, villains, or just creatures or whatever, that represents something greater than itself, you should explain to the audience, either directly or indirectly, what it is representing, and in the deep detail in how it makes the protagonist feel. For example, in my own hero series, The Horror and Heroes, angels cover their faces with mirror masks that reflect the faces of whoever is looking at them back at them. This is maddening for many people because the idea of something as powerful as an angel reflecting back everything that they are back at themselves is unsettling for a lot of people. A lot of people can't sit with the idea and self examine who they are or something thoroughly self examining them and just reflecting it back at them. A little bit of cosmic horror, a little bit of religious horror. Plus, there's the taboo of the angels revealing their faces, and then there's the unspoken aspect of the this is an incredibly powerful cosmic being, and if you truly saw its face, it would drive you insane. The idea of not being able to face yourself or even look at yourself in a mirror is an inherently scary thing to me and many people close to me, but I would need to explain that to most audiences. The idea of not being able to face yourself in the mirror, and that fact making the angels scary. So if you're doing something like, let's say, you have a monster that represents someone's hunger, so then you might want something that gets stronger with time, something that gets stronger unless it feeds, something that is persistent, something that keeps pursuing, and something that isn't going to run away from you. So again, that is something representing something else. So even if you don't directly explain it, it should at least be explainable. If you want to make something represent something else, you should understand that and then just generally explain it either directly or indirectly. Because again, they don't necessarily have to be super clear, but making it consistent will go a long way. It's kind of the difference between you get the it from It Follows and you get the it from Stephen King's It. Those are two very different its, but they're both things that represent something else that can shapeshift and be invisible to most people. So again, those can represent something bigger than itself. And again, by understanding what it is in different ways, you can get some very interesting things. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to our next tip. Now, as we discussed earlier, setting is as much a character as any other character in your story. How familiar is your protagonist is or isn't with the story can make them feel safe or unsafe, and this can be incredibly unsettling for people. How does the setting interact with people? Is it even aware of them, or is it not? Is there something in the setting that may help the protagonist, or is it actively hindering it? Is there something from the setting that the protagonist wants? Is there something in the setting that makes it antagonistic to the character's wants? Is it something that is made from something that was familiar and now made unfamiliar? Or is it something unfamiliar now made familiar? Again, just inverting simple things can be a real fun thought process. And again, I've already discussed setting in other videos and in other templates. But yes, remember, your setting is a character. Everything we've discussed from characters, even biases, is something you can examine. Even something as simple as, okay, you want a wild space that is just outside the city. Cool. What does that look like? Well, for a lot of Americans, they imagine the woods. They imagine the woods just outside their town or city. And for other people or other places, it might be the desert. It might be a wasteland. It might be even be an old city itself that was abandoned. It might be a ghost town. It might be the caves. It might be the mountains. It might even be the ocean itself. So again, just the idea of what is this wild place that represents unknown or known dangers can look different depending on where your character is or what they're doing. And again, really sit with yourself and examine what these mean, because your own biases may be exposed there. Oh, you're thinking of the wild area representing a possible danger? Well, I'm immediately thinking the woods. Okay, why are you thinking the woods? Some characters who may know the woods pretty well may feel completely safe in the woods. And again, you can make something that is normally safe suddenly feel like a threat. Five Nights at Freddy's and frickin' mascot horror in general thrives on that. That idea of these child's friendly or familiar places made dangerous. So again, your setting is a character. Everything we talked about with the characters, examine your setting through those lenses, and you're going to find yourself in a lot of fun places. Alignment charts like they do for D&D can be helpful if writing a D&D fantasy or RPG based setting. Again, those can be a valid way of doing things. Fallout TV show is successful. They're working on a BioShock TV show at time of recording. The D&D The Honor Among Thieves was a fun thing. She-Ra, Princesses of Power was great, and they had alignment charts there too. If you try applying alignment charts outside of a D&D inspired narrative, you might find it actually limiting. So if you try applying a D&D alignment chart to, let's say Friday the 13th, the original one, you might find characters may fit one or more of those definitions, or you might find that you have to either stretch or limit these definitions to make it work. So if you aren't sure where to start making characters in good or evil, it can be good to start with like an alignment chart, especially since there's lots of them and lots of different YouTubers and everyone else talking about how to use them. However, not all of us can or even want to write stories like She-Ra, Princesses of Power, or Honor Among Thieves. Great show and great movie, and I have seen people write fantastic stories with the idea of alignment charts as a starting point. But I personally don't use alignment charts. So in short use of alignment charts can definitely be a starting point for characters or character sheets. Again, those are great ways to start, especially if you're making RPGs or RPG-inspired narratives. But if you start finding yourself dictating actions of the narrative not based on the story you want to tell, but by the character's alignment chart, you may want to reconsider using this tool. Because one of the many things that characters do in stories that they may not necessarily do in an RPG is they change. They call them story arcs for a reason. The character at the end of the story can be a completely different or even unrecognizable character from the beginning, or you may simply reveal more of the character in the end than you did the beginning. And again, character arcs and change is a valid way of doing things. So if you're trying to make a narrative work based on someone's alignment, reconsider it. And if you find that a character sheet is not helpful, you may change it. And again, these can be good tools to start with, and I do recommend trying to use them. But by no means should you try to be chained to them. Because if you chain yourself to them, you may find yourself writing a story you don't actually want to write. Next tip and trick I'm going to give you is know your audience. When you are writing, know the audience you are telling the story for. Is the story just for you? Is it for a friend? Is it for a general audience? Is it for a specific part of your general audience? Know the audience you are writing it for, and it will make it easier for you to know what you are writing. For example, I am doing this entire video based on the idea that my audience listening are people who want to be writers, people who are at least interested in the idea of things like horror, sci-fi, or fantasy, essentially fictional concepts that are not realistic. So that's why I'm focusing on more unrealistic aspects to try to get people started. And again, although some of the aspects here can be used for realistic fiction, romance, comedy, things like that, and I've mentioned them briefly, you've noticed I didn't focus on them because that's not my intended audience. And I'm not aiming this at an audience that knows, at an audience that could be anyone. I'm aiming it for an audience that knows horror. I'm aiming it for an audience that is nerdy, and I'm aiming it at an audience that likes fantasy, sci-fi, or similar concepts. Because again, for my examples, I could have used things like Mean Girls. I could have used examples like Hilary Duff's Day Out. I could have used whatever that Pretty in Pink movie is that I think is literally called Pretty in Pink. I could have used Super Troopers as an example. All of them have great examples of characterization and believable characters within their narrative. But I'm not using those examples because that's not the audience I'm aiming it for. But again, you like those things or you're like part of that audience, welcome. I welcome you. Thank you for being so late in this video. But again, knowing your audience and who you're writing it for will make it easier for you to know what you are writing and what kind of characters you're going to make. For example, The Last Kids on Earth is going to have a very different tone and conflict from, say, I Am Legend or Why the Last Man. despite any superficial similarities of them being some of the last most human characters within their narrative. You don't need to make your story for an audience that won't like your story. In fact, I'm going to explore that a little bit more, or in the next tip and trick. Tell the story you want. Yes, you should know your audience, and that's fine, but tell the story you want to the audience that you know is there. To sum up what this means, sometimes it can get frustrating when you try to avoid or add certain plots or tropes, not because it's something you want to avoid or add, but because you're trying to appeal to an audience that isn't there. I had someone on the live stream ask me directly, how do you avoid character archetypes are important? So how do you avoid stereotypes or cliches? You add details that you want, and you as the writer write what you want, not just because it's something that's expected, not because it's something that's unexpected. Write it because it's the best that you want for the story you want to tell. When you do something like that, you're going to start avoiding cliches and stereotypes, not necessarily because that's what you were intending, but because you're telling the story that you want. You, as the writer, are a unique person. You can write stories that are unique and that are yours just because they're your stories. So when you look at it from that way, you're going to do a lot more with that. If you're writing a romance and you need miscommunication to drive the story where you want to go, by all means, add that miscommunication. Sure, it's easy to make fun of, especially if you're not a big fan of romances. But at the same time, if you are a fan of romances, it's something you've come to accept, or maybe even something you've come to love. And if you're writing for an audience that's just you, write what you want. If you're writing an audience that's kids, tell a story that's for kids. Just make sure it's a story that's, for kids that you want to tell. If you're writing a story for adults, write a story you want and for the adults. Don't try to appeal for an audience that's not there. Don't try to appeal for an audience that's going to scoff at you and be like, of course you added this. Of course the slasher caught the girl. Of course SpongeBob fought Hasselhoff in the SpongeBob movie. Of course the random thing happened in the random movie. Of course there's killer clowns in this killer clowns movie. Don't try to appeal it to someone who's already going to criticize this just for being what it is. You don't need to write something to appeal to something like CinemaSins, pitch meetings, or the critics. Knowing your audience can come in handy for this because that's who you're writing it for. If you're writing a zombie action movie where the main part you want to write is your wife fighting zombies in the coolest ways you can think of, by all means do that. They made like 8 Resident Evil movies based on that premise. You don't need to avoid doing it just because a critic on YouTube is going to get paid money to point out plot consistencies or contrivances. Because again, even if you do enjoy those videos and even if they are funny or they bring up a point, you have to remember they get paid to point out plot contrivances or plot inconsistencies or make up plot inconsistencies or contrivances where there are or may not even be any. So again, you don't have to appeal for them. If you want to write for that audience and try to make something that critics are going to love, by all means try to write that, but understand that's what you as the writer are trying to make. And you will write a story and try to appeal to those critics. Or you might want to appeal to a different audience altogether. Understand your audience and tell the story you want to. If you as a writer don't like a trope or a plot point, feel free to change it. Or if you want to explore something that isn't normally explored in stories like yours, feel free to do that. It is your story, and in my opinion, we need more storytellers. Storytellers, not storytellies. That sounds like a Teletubby freaking ripoff. Jesus Christ. I'm getting to the loopy point of the video. So we need many more storytellers. Many, many more. We need more stories told. We need perspectives. We need people that aren't me. If you want to write a mech comic where the protagonist is a park ranger using their mech to fight poachers in mechs trying to poach kaiju on reserves, please, for the love of God, write that story. That is a great story. I love that comic. If you want to write a story about a black witch who likes to deal with fairies and likes to protect other witches from humans, write that story. Don't do a plot point just because it's what's expected. Do it because it's something you want or because you need it for the story. And also don't avoid plot points you do want just because you imagine that someone else may not like it. If you like it and you feel that it's appropriate for your story, by all means write it. Let yourself explore, let yourself do these things. If you want to write an astronaut story that's going to have dinosaurs, do that. If you want to do a creepypasta story where the monster is a killer marshmallow, do that too. Ghostbusters became a popular movie. Remember that. And again, write the stories you want and aim it for the audience that you want. If it does get popular and there's an audience there that wasn't intended for it and they don't like it, that's fine. They weren't the intended audience and it's not their story. If you see a story that you don't like and you think you can do better, go out there, do better. I've known people who saw Twilight and they're like, I can write a better vampire fic, and they started writing vampire stories. I know people who saw 50 Shades of Grey and thought, I could write something sexier than this. And then they started writing something sexier than this. Heck, the whole reason I created something like the JRT is because there was a story about a blood-sucking landlord who tricked someone into writing a contract, and then everyone was like, well, you signed the contract, there's nothing we can do. My immediate thought is, well, there's several legal routes we can explore. So I thought, hey, wouldn't it be fun if there was an entire lawyer agency just dealing with Fey law, just dealing with creepypasta law, and just explaining the whole premise of just because there's a contract doesn't mean that what they're doing is legal. And that's where the Jade, Raquel, and Themis thing came from. And I think I wrote some great stuff with those contracts. And again, that is another form of inspiration. If you want to write something just because you're like, I could do better, do better. So also consider that a separate tip point. If you want to portray a character a certain way, have a beta reader look it over, either professionally, a friend, or a reading buddy. Have your reader go over the character you have, either in an outline, story, or even just their backstory. When done, have them explain to you what they think of the character. Not just if they like them or not, but what do they understand of the character? Do they think they're good or evil? Do they think they're creepy or comforting? Do they think they're manipulative or honest? Do they think they're loving or hateful? When your reader explains to you what kind of character they think your character is like, then tell them afterwards what character you were going for. Then you can both discuss if you successfully wrote the character in the way you are aiming for, or if there are changes you need to do, or even if you wrote a character in a way you weren't intending at all, maybe you find that this way of doing the character was actually more effective. Again, that's a completely valid way of doing a character. It is important that your beta reader reads it first, then tells you what kind of character they think they are, before you tell them your intention. So that way you can decide what changes, if any, you need to do for your characters. It also lets you be able to spot any biases or any kind of trends or expectations you were going for that you may not even consciously be aware of. Fresh pair of eyes doesn't hurt. Know your characters. Understand your characters at least a little deeper than you show your audience. If you are telling the audience about a coffee shop, you should be able to clearly visualize the coffee shop, at least to yourself, before you write it down. Think about the coffee shop you know and base the setting off of it so you have an idea of what you're doing. If you are describing a monster, you may know the backstory more than what is revealed. You may understand what the monster represents more than what is revealed to the protagonist. Try not to get too crazy and paralyze yourself without writing, but definitely have more understanding than what you reveal. And definitely don't reveal more than you understand, because then you get all kinds of monsters that feel like the writers clearly didn't understand what they were doing. And if you're wondering if you're being too crazy with understanding, you're being too crazy with understanding. Basically, you can definitely let yourself understand and know your characters, but don't get so deep into understanding your characters that you are no longer able to write. Sometimes just let yourself explore a little bit. And ultimately, to make characters believable, understanding goes a long way. And by showing understanding and empathy with the characters around the protagonist, even understanding or empathy with an antagonist or enemy, you can make believable characters, or you can make characters that are appealing for the audience. You can also use it to try to avoid things where, like, well, clearly this character is in the wrong. It's just like, I just watched that character almost get killed, and they defended themselves. or situations like that trope that not everyone, but a lot of people dislike. Firstly, you kill all the bad guy's minions, but then you won't actually kill the bad guy because then you're just as bad as the bad guy. You get a fun inversion of the trope in Resident Evil Apocalypse, where Alice has one of the head leaders of Umbrella in the helicopter, and he tells her, "Killing me won't make things right." And she's like, "No, but it's a start." And then she threw him out the helicopter. Again, fun inversion of that. Just kind of that he's killed pretty much everyone in that city and practically the entire planet in the near future. So yeah, him saying killing me won't make things right, she's acknowledging, yes, it won't make the world right, but it's a good start towards things. Again, really think about things and understand it. If you want to do a trope because you like it, by all means do that, but be sure you understand it. If you want to deconstruct a trope and do something else, you also need to understand it. To put it simply, when you're building a house, you have to start with a single brick. So you have to understand the brick that you're building before you can build everything else. And if you're trying to deconstruct a house, you also need to understand how the house is built so you can take it apart without it falling on you. So you may find that unlike most things, in most cases, destruction is easier than creation. In writing, it's actually the other way around. You may find that creating something based on a template is a lot easier than trying to take a template and take it apart. So definitely be sure you understand before you go into anything like that. Now, if anyone has any questions, you are welcome to email me. You are welcome to post it in the comments and I'll try to answer them, or maybe even do a video on it in the future. If you like these videos or like the art or like anything I'm doing with the channel, feel free to check out my Ko-fi. I've got the newsletter that I do with Leanne James down there, so we're hoping to post some new stuff there too. Also hoping to do a writing group in the near future. Don't know when, don't know how, but we're trying. And maybe you do want to buy me a lavender latte, so feel free to buy me a coffee down there as well. And if you just want to check out the other stuff I've written or check out other stuff I've done, feel free to just check that out too. Thank you so much, everyone. And whether you want to be the cause of someone's pleasant dreams or worst nightmares, I just hope that this video helped inspire you to write just a little bit.